Chapter 10, A Poor Majority, the Second Referendum Campaign. In late June 1948, during the tense period between the first and the second referendum, Commonwealth Secretary Philip Noel Baker recalled Governor Gordon MacDonald to London to determine the constitutional steps that would be taken between the final vote and the handover of power to Ottawa. The contingency plan, the return of responsible government, was a simple and straightforward matter. The 1934 letters patent would be revoked and the general election held for a new government to take over on January 1st, 1949. The other path led through murky and uncharted constitutional territories where they must blaze their own trail. These top-secret meetings also included Sir Eric Machin from the Commonwealth Relations Office, Albert Walsh, the Commissioner of Justice in Newfoundland, Norman Robertson, the Canadian High Commissioner to London, and M.H. Wershoff, Wershoff, of the Canadian High Commission Office in St. John's. Having brushed aside the return of responsible government, the British North American Act, and all legal means at hand for Newfoundland to join Canada, the two conspiring countries were again faced with the tricky, still unresolved question of how exactly they would accomplish the union of the absence of a Newfoundland government. As Robertson thought about several issues under consideration, he wrote in a telegram marked "Secret" to External Affairs in Ottawa. The next question is, by what legal process is union to be accomplished? The Commonwealth Relations Office said the United Kingdom government would be most anxious to avoid putting the terms of union through the Parliament of the United Kingdom once there has been a satisfactory vote for the Confederation, and that the terms of union are of no concern to the United Kingdom. Although the terms of union were of primary concern to Newfoundland, the islanders would not be permitted to debate or negotiate them. As Robertson continued, the solution to the Commonwealth Relations Office and the governor think is to amend S. 146 of the BNA, which is the British North American Act, to provide that the Commission of Government of Newfoundland, fortified by the results of the referendum, should be competent to make the address to His Majesty, which as S. 146 now reads, must be made by the non-existent legislature of Newfoundland. Even though earlier in the telegram he insisted that the Commission of Government has been rejected by the voters, and the sooner it is ended, the better. He now suggests that the outgoing administration should still be asked to perform one final constitutional convolution. Even a defeated dictatorship should be competent to assume the authority of a non-existing legislature, it seemed. The request to amend Section 146 and dispense with the need for a Newfoundland government would have to come from the Canadian government, the other party in the negotiations, and office officials there were only too happy to oblige. In this way, in the shady underworld of international intrigue, the Anglo-Canadian plot progressed to rob Newfoundlanders of their right to represent themselves in any union with Canada. That left only the problem of the referendum to sort out, and the plotters felt less confident in this area. The governor of Newfoundland and the Commissioner of Justice, Albert Walsh, said that in their view, there is no chance of a big majority for Confederation, certainly not more than 3,000, and very probably much less. Governor MacDonald was fearful that a decision to process with Confederation in the face of a very narrow majority might indeed lead to disturbances in Newfoundland, and particularly in St. John's, where a large majority of the population strongly favored responsible government. He insisted that, in view of the political conditions in Newfoundland, there should be no undue delay in establishing a new government. Commissioner Walsh cautiously attempted to slow down the machinery if the majority is very small. He warned it would not be wise to base upon it an irrevocable constitutional change. 2 years earlier, in the spring of 1946, after one of his many meetings with Governor Gordon MacDonald, Scott MacDonald had reported to External Affairs that the governor had informed him that both Prime Minister Attlee and the Secretary of State for Dominions Affairs had told him confidentially that they regarded union with Canada as the best thing that could happen to Newfoundland, and would be happy if it could be brought about with a large majority of the people. In fact, Governor MacDonald had stated that a 2/3 majority would be necessary to transfer sovereignty, and the Canadians, especially Prime Minister Mackenzie King, felt the same way. But in July 1948, as they prepared for the possibility of a small majority in the second referendum, the British and the Canadian officials had to decide exactly how small the majority could be and which of them would make that decision. It was a hot potato neither of them wanted to handle. As External Affairs put it, secret. Should any questions arise to the size of the majority of union which would be required by the Canadian government, the UK government should be informed that this was primarily a matter for decision by the UK government. And from London, Norman Robertson wrote to St. Laurent on July 2nd, secret. On the United Kingdom side, it has been made clear that they would regard any majority for Confederation, however small, as binding, and that, if the decision were solely for them, they would arrange for Confederation, even though the majority were as small as one. It was certainly a long way from Attlee's and Addison's large majority to a majority as small as one. But the British felt confident of bridging the gap. The voters in Newfoundland had no inkling of this change in attitude, but the British had only a few cards left to play. They would see the end of their They could see the end of their responsibilities to Newfoundland, and they were determined to get out at all costs. On July 16th, a defiant Lester Pearson responded to Robertson in London. Important, secret. It would appear that in the event of the majority being too small to justify proceeding with Confederation, the United Kingdom would like to place full responsibility for the decision on the Canadian government. We would like if possible, to avoid this, since it might well prejudice any later chances of Confederation. If you have an opportunity, would you please stress with the CRO that while we appreciate their view that Canada should have the deciding voice as to whether Newfoundland should be accepted in the event of a very small majority, we hope that if circumstances require that this course be taken, the United Kingdom will appreciate the desirability of at least endorsing Canada's position in the matter. The Canadians required the backing of the United Kingdom to carry off this constitutional coup. Both empires would put their credibility on the line, hold their noses if need be, and sign off on the deal. On July 12th, after Governor MacDonald had returned to St. John's from his secret meetings in London, Noel Baker drafted a dispatch to confirm that the London meetings were designed to ensure, as far as possible, that you and I were in agreement as to the actions which will have to be taken. The following day, the nervous Sir Gordon replied to Noel Baker, "I would be advisable to have within a day's outing of St. John's a cruiser or destroyer on Friday night, July 23rd, the day after the vote. We should need to know how to contact the ship to inform the commander as soon as possible as to whether it was necessary for him to sail into St. John's Harbour. I am sorry that one is unavailable to be more defiant, but you know the difficulty, especially as the whole matter is to be kept top secret. For the moment, at least, Governor MacDonald's accustomed blusters and air of invisibility wavered before the spectre of the crowd's fury. At the outcome he was to announce, tensions were running high in both British and Canadian camps as they approached their final play. One day, now, sorry, let me start that again. One, they now knew full well would not be a clear victory beyond all possibilities of misunderstanding. The Canadians were optimistic, perhaps overly so, because they continued to ignore the major financial difficulties for Newfoundland as the 10th province of Canada. R.L. James, the Finance Commissioner for the Commission of Government, was well aware of the problems, however, and discussed them with Paul Bridle, who was still the acting Canadian High Commissioner in St. John's. On June 21st, Bridle wrote to Mackay as the secret meetings in London were getting underway. Secret and personal. The points mentioned by Mr. James were as followed. It appears that the Newfoundland provincial government will be unable from the outset to balance its budget. The gap between revenue and expenditures is difficult to estimate, but in Mr. James' opinion, it is likely to be considerable. I told Mr. James that I was rather surprised to find he anticipates a substantial provincial deficit at the outset, and that we had ourselves anticipated that the provincial budget would be would come very close to balancing in the first 3 years of the Union. He also made the point that the Newfoundland provincial government, unlike the existing provincial government, would have to meet the cost of such essentials and expensive services as education, public health, road reconstruction, almost entirely unaided by local government. Mr. James' main point is that no matter how much one may reduce expenditures, a certain number such as those he mentioned would inevitably have to be carried on by any Newfoundland government, be it an independent government or a provincial government. Mr. James' fundamental assumptions regarding the provincial budget is so familiar to that of those critics of Confederation who would be the first to demand better terms that I felt in talking to him I must defend our position. It seems that his appraisal of the budgetary aspects of the terms would inevitably reinforce any predisposition on the part of Newfoundland representatives to seek better terms. The rather nice question of the degree of control which the Newfoundland government, the British Commission of Government, would have over the delegation arises here, of course. At the same time, it is relevant here to recall that some 2 weeks ago the governor remarked to me that there would be no difficulty at all in appointing suitable representatives and finalizing the terms. The High Commissioner answered his own key question about the degree of control the Commission of Government would have over the Newfoundland delegates. Less than a fortnight later, Norman Robertson in London, after his talks with Governor MacDonald, confirmed in a secret telegram with External Affairs. The governor has already decided whom he would ask to be on the Newfoundland delegation, which would go to Ottawa to discuss and settle with the Canadian government the full terms and arrangements. The anti-Confederation people would be represented on it, but most of its members, 5 out of 10, would be pro-Confederation. The Canadians were concerned not with the considerable financial shortfall for the new province, but only with selecting the delegation from Newfoundland to accept the deal. The governor's control over this delegation was crucial. Governor Gordon MacDonald used his constitutional authority and position as head of government in Newfoundland to guarantee Newfoundland's acceptance of Canada's terms of union before they were negotiated or even voted on. This abuse of office by the appointed official of a government freshly defeated at the polls continues a serious offense against the people of Newfoundland and casts grave doubt on the legality of the final constitution arrangements between Newfoundland and Canada. Earlier that year, on February 9th, in response to a question posed by the Evening Telegram on how the actual union of Canada and Newfoundland should be effected in the event of a Confederate victory in the coming referendum, J.B. McAvoy, the past chairman of the National Convention and new leader of the Confederate Party, had written, "If the Office of Commonwealth Relations decides that Confederation is to go to the referendum ballot paper, it should go on only in principle and not on the basis of the present terms, which are unnegotiated. If the people favor Confederation in principle, This would mean that the question of responsible government would be erased, and the Commission of Government would be retained temporarily and empowered to negotiate final terms of Confederation with the Canadian government. The result of these negotiations would be submitted to the people, who would then vote for or against union on the basis of the new negotiated terms. And in fact, this would mean 2 referendums. The present terms of Confederation were received by a delegation hampered by their lack of power, and the people should not be asked to make an irrevocable decision based on the unnegotiated terms which the delegation received. McAvoy naturally presumed that the Newfoundland public would have the right to vote on a would have the right to vote on and ratify the terms of union after they were negotiated, not before. But in the Alice in Wonderland world of the constitutional process created by the British in Newfoundland, it took McAvoy some time to realize that up was actually down, and he later apologized for his too logical assumption. After the first referendum vote and a lengthy talk with the Canadian High Commissioner, he came to an entirely different opinion, as Bridle reported to St. Laurent on July 17th. Mr. McAvoy said that in February of this year he had stated in an interview with a newspaper reporter that he felt the Newfoundlanders should vote in the referendum on Confederation in principle only, a final decision being postponed until a later date. When, however, the British government decides otherwise, he applied himself to a study of Confederation and of the terms offered in the same way that he had investigated the proposal for economic union with the United States. He arrived at the conclusion that Confederation is the best course for Newfoundland, and that even though the terms have not been negotiated, it would be impossible to effect any material change in them. While now adopting Canada's novel position and its terms of union, McAvoy still acknowledged fully that those terms had never been negotiated, and that the elected delegates from the National Convention had never possessed the mandate in their term of reference to negotiate anything. McAvoy's apology was accepted, but the damage to his future political ambitions had been done. On June 21st, the same day that Bridle informed Mackay of the bad news in R.L. James' report, Smallwood and Bradley wrote to C.D. Howe about a significant new group of Confederates. McAvoy had been able to poach Commissioners Herman Quinton and Herbert Pollett from the Commission of Government, but the most significant catch were several of the hated and much vilified Water Street merchants, in particular Sir Eric Bowring, Sir Leonard Outerbridge, and the Monroes, Senior and Junior. These men, Smallwood noted, would bring to the cause what it has hitherto lacked, namely the respectable element of society. The result, he predicted, would be a comfortable majority for Confederation. Following immediately On this positive message, he informed how that the Confederate side needed at least another 20,000. We need it quickly. The second referendum was more desperately engaged and dirtier than the first. Smallwood had got through to Ches Crosby, Geoff Sterling, and others, and effectively neutralized the Economic Union Party. Jim Haley, C. E. Hunt, D. I. Jackman, and the rest carried on, but the party was no longer a major force behind the Responsible Government League. The League itself redoubled its efforts, sending out teams to canvass across the island. However, these workers did not have nearly the reach of the Confederates, who already had well-organized teams in place and enough money to hire Confederate agents in every district. That was significant because many illiterate voters had to indicate to the returning officer or the poll clerk which way they wished to vote. Polls with only Confederate officers, and there were many, played a decisive role in delivering the Confederate vote. One shocked voter wrote to F. M. O'Leary of the Responsible Government League on July 29th. Honestly, I believe this referendum crooked in strong Confederate centers where illiteracy is great. I may be wrong, but I have a feeling voters were illegally marked in stations where poll officials were both Confederate and where no responsible government agent was present. Cannot understand why magistrate was not allowed to open ballots in my presence so that I could check, count, and compare with that reported by message from various stations. This is all most undemocratic, and I vehemently protest conduct and procedure of this referendum. There was nothing to prevent an ardent Confederate deputy from marking illiterate ballots for Confederation where we had no agents. Responsible Government League voters in Champney East and other outports later complained that their votes had not been counted in their community totals. The Responsible Government League also worked without any external support, while the Confederates enjoyed not only tactical support from the Canadians, the Commission of Government, and the British, but even more Canadian money, this time augmented by contributions from local businessmen shopping for senatorships. On orders from Smallwood, no receipts were kept. The religious card had been played with some apparent success in the first referendum. The Confederates condemned the power of Rome in St. John's in the person of Archbishop Roche, who presumed to require a return to self-rule before there could be any consideration of Confederation. In this opinion, the population was not sufficiently informed of the implications of Confederation to make an irrevocable decision is a plebiscite. Both the Economic Union Party and the Responsible Government League refused to capitalize on sectarian divisions. Wick Collins, the secretary of the Responsible Government League, wrote that the League had neither the intention nor the talent to engage in a war of deceit. vilification, or ridicule. Smallwood and the Confederates, in contrast, eagerly exploited religious bias as well as regional rivalries and class hatred in their all-out attempt to divide town from outport, Protestants from Catholic, rich from poor. As Harold Horwood of the Confederate Party recorded, the religious divide in particular was considered as a split we could use to great profit. At this point, Governor Gordon MacDonald himself mounted the pulpits at St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church and at Gower Secret United Church in St. John's to lend his moral and constitutional authority to the Protestant Confederate forces. At a Methodist convention in the city, he declared, "There is one denomination here, the Roman Catholics, which played a big part in the last referendum. It is time that the Protestant bodies should unite. In the Union of American Counsel General Winwright Abbott, the governor's performance served only to inflame the Responsible Government League and prove conclusively their charge that the British, at the instigation of Canada, had connived to railroad Newfoundland into union with Canada. Many people were distressed at the reopening of old sectarian rivalries. But a convention delegate felt that during the second referendum campaign, Newfoundland came close to civil war than at any time in its history. The Catholics felt isolated by the political establishment, and several prominent people told him before the vote that Newfoundland would be going into Confederation regardless, and that they had to do what they had to do. In an appeal to pro-British and Protestant sentiments on the Avalon Peninsula, Smallwood devised a new slogan, "British Union with Canada," which he hoped would siphon off the commission votes from the first referendum. The basic appeal of the second Confederate campaign, however, remained the same as the first: Canada's new social programs, the family allowance, and the old age pension. In the later days of the race, Smallwood campaigned extensively by airplane in the remotest regions, bursting through the clouds to proclaim the new gospel of Confederation through a loudspeaker. In many places, the campaign took on messianic overtones, as Smallwood cheerfully delivered his message in biblical terms. Against this onslaught, the Responsible Government League fought valiantly, but it failed to articulate a clear and compelling vision of Newfoundland under a renewed responsible government. Paul Bridle continued to provide Ottawa with detailed accounts of the various campaigns right up to the last moments before the vote. In his long dispatch on July 19th, he reported on C.C. Pratt, a prominent Newfoundland businessman and brother of Canadian poet and Professor E.J. Pratt, in a passionate radio broadcast in favor of responsible government. Pratt had claimed, "If we vote ourselves into Confederation at this stage, we have not got one vestige of bargaining power left. We shall be placed in the humiliating position of first having made a deal and then with our hands out ask Canada to adjust our difficulties as a favor and not as a right. As I see it, this is a position which a self-respecting people should avoid at all cost. Writing in the Evening Telegram on behalf of the Economic Union Party, D.I. Jackman, its former leader, warned, "It seems as if speed is not needed at present in a hurry attempt at Confederation. If Newfoundland will first appoint their legal representatives, the present terms or even new ones will be considered in the future after a period of cooling off and a serious mediation on where Newfoundland's best interests will be. There is no incompatibility in adjusting her best interests with those of Canada and the United States, with a government of her own people first." All the time, Joy Smallwood plied the airways, and in Bridle's assessment, once again showed his extraordinary capacity to appeal in a direct and simple manner to the common sense of the average person. In the later part of his address, he demonstrated his equal skill as an uninhibited propagandist. Besides enlisting the open support of Commissioners Paulet and Quinton in return for positions in the new provincial government, Smallwood, with McAvoy's help, now recruited the third Newfoundland Commissioner, Albert Walsh, all of whom provided the connection with the outgoing government and gave the Confederate cause added status, if not inevitably. When Governor Gordon MacDonald came out of Confederation and against responsible government, the veneers of impartiality was stripped away as the most powerful institution and individual, the Commissioner of Government. Joy Smallwood and High Commissioner Charles Burchell, in addition to the Governor, all united in support of Confederation. Nevertheless, in Ottawa, 2 days before the vote in the second referendum, Mackenzie King and even Louis St. Laurent expressed serious misgivings about the prospect ahead. As the Prime Minister wrote in his diary, St. Laurent personally feels, and I agree, that unless there is something more than a poor majority, we should not take the province into Confederation. The estimate the Department of External Affairs have is that Confederation will carry, but with a very small majority. The second referendum was held on July 22nd, 1948. Paul Bridle reported the final count. Responsible government, 71,464 votes. Confederation with Canada, 77,896 votes. Confederation secured 52% of the vote, with a little over 6,000 votes more than responsible government. The voter turnout was 150,000 of the possible 176,000. Some 5,000 voters fewer than in the first referendum. U.S. Consul General Wainwright Abbott wrote to the State Department on August 2nd. Had it not been for the success of the governor in obtaining the aid of the United Church, the Orangemen, 2 of the commissioners, and a few other prominent citizens, Walsh and Outbridge, at the last moment, the result would have probably been different. Mr. Joseph Smallwood attracted a large following with his promises of family allowance, but he repelled a great many of the more substantial class by his extreme claims and by his injection of class hatred and regional differences into the campaign. The new men who came out at the last moment reassured more conservative voters and cast an aura of respectability about the Confederate Party, which had been lacking before. Having made use of Smallwood's undoubted organizing and demagogic talents, these new accessions to Confederation are now faced with a problem of how to get rid of him, which they privately stated they wish and intend to do so. He is reported to have an almost hypnotic influence over the audience which he addresses, and the more conservative elements may well find that it is easier to release a genie from a bottle than to persuade him to return. In the somber atmosphere in St. John's following the final results, Bridle wrote to St. Lawrence, "I am convinced that something of the meaning of Confederation has entered the minds of the masses of the people of Newfoundland. If one were to signal out one Newfoundlander more responsible than the other for this development, one would name Mr. J.R. Smallwood. He is known in this country as the Apostle of Confederation." The Canadians had reluctantly recognized their savior. There were no riots in St. John's, but nerves were still on edge at Government House. Frank Graham of Imperial Oil, a friend of the Vice-Regal family, said that the governor and his wife lived in dread of attack. As for the destroyer, Governor MacDonald had requested to be sent to St. John's if only because of the safety of the governor and commissioners may come into question. Lord Hall of the Admiralty informed Noel Baker that no destroyer was near enough to answer the call in time. It is perhaps unfortunate the destroyer was not available to sit in St. John's Harbour, so that the populace who had contributed to magnificently to recent war could see the guns pointed at them and obtained a clearer perspective of their place in the events unfolding around them. If this was the shotgun that was thought necessary to enforce the Union, it was not required. All the newspapers, including the Sunday Herald, called on the people to unite and work together for the success of the new province of Newfoundland. The Responsible Government League immediately went on record to oppose the procedures as unconstitutional. On July 25th, 3 days after the vote, the secretary of the League wrote directly to Mackenzie King. Personal, Responsible Government League. Speaking with the force and backing of more than 70,000 voters, representing 48% of those voting in the July 22nd referendum, vigorously protest any procedure other than negotiation conducted through properly elected government for inclusion Newfoundland in Canadian Federation. We dispute constitutional rights, commission government to determine what is satisfactory majority because commission was totally repudiated in first referendum and has subsequently prejudiced in its position as impartial arbitrator. This vital matter through intervention by two of its members, Paulette and Quinton, as spokesmen for Confederate cause. Consummation of Confederation before negotiation of terms or understanding of financial and economic impacts of Newfoundland people and industry is neither sound nor just, and creates source of bitter controversy in the future. On July 30th, in his response to a request from the League to send a delegation to Ottawa, Mackenzie King felt compelled once again to state, "The Canadian government has at no time intervened in any way in the determination of the procedures to be followed in Newfoundland." Aside from such denials, Canada, now confronted with the reality of the poor majority, said nothing at first. Observing Canada's silence, Sir Eric Machen at the Commonwealth Relations Office in London wrote an agitated note to High Commissioner Alexander Clutterbuck in Ottawa. Immediate, secret, and personal. I have today received private letter from Gordon MacDonald dated July 23rd. He asked that this should be treated as very private, mainly, of course, because he does not wish anyone in Newfoundland to know that he has written in this way. The result of the referendum would give Confederation at least 5,000 majority. I consider it a fine achievement. In my personal opinion, there is only one course for the Canadian authorities, namely to accept the decision and to ask for a delegation of authorized representatives to be appointed, and to state that such a delegation would be received at an early date. There must be no hesitation on the part of Canada authorities. Any sign whatsoever of hesitation will be fatal. The vote was 5,000 times better than a majority of one, and certainly good enough for the British to brazen it out. But the Canadians were unsuited to such a bold action. Mackenzie King remained doubtful about the fine achievement and questioned whether a majority of barely 52% would be accepted as enough to transfer sovereignty. Jack Pickersgill, who would later become Newfoundland's financial minister in Ottawa during the Smallwood administration, was prepared for these doubts. He reminded King that in the last two federal elections, the Prime Minister had won his own seat by an even smaller majority. That argument proved sufficient to Mackenzie King, and on July 30th, he declared in a statement, "The result of the plebiscite in favor of union between the two countries is clear and beyond possibility of misunderstanding." He then repeated for a third time that this result was attained without any trace of influence or pressure from Canada. And that brings us to the end of Chapter 10. Thank you so much for continuing to learn and continuing to listen to these recordings. Sorry, my reading is a little hesitant at times, but it's just a language barrier. Thank you.